One day, I moved into my new apartment, a small place I had carefully chosen right after graduating from high school. The move was part of a new experience, as I had enrolled in a technical school in a small city outside my hometown. For the first time in my life, I was living alone, away from the warmth of family and my mother's loving care. My mother had made sure to choose the apartment with me. She saw it as a safe haven, in an area that seemed quiet and reassuring, close to the school, where people were always around. My mother was worried, as she was used to being concerned and fearful for me, and I had grown up sheltered, surrounded by her constant care and caution. She watched me carefully as I contemplated my newfound freedom and said, "It's a safe place, my dear. You'll always be in the public eye." Yet, despite all that security, moving in was both frightening and thrilling. The freedom was tempting, but it came with an anxiety I couldn't easily shake off. In the end, I was excited about my independence, about having control over every detail of my life, even the scattered clothes that I didn't have to pick up right away. A few days later, the TV I had ordered arrived. It wasn't very big, but it was just right for my small room. The delivery man knocked on the door, carrying the TV all by himself, which seemed impressive to me. When he stood in the middle of the room, a new problem arose. I looked at the TV as if it were a complicated monster. How was I supposed to set it up? I had no idea how to connect the wires or set the channels. Embarrassment flooded over me, and I couldn't hide my confusion. The delivery man noticed my hesitation and awkwardness, and he gave a small smile before politely asking, "Do you need help?" I couldn't believe my luck. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and invited him in. He did everything quickly and skillfully, and within a few minutes, the TV was up and running. I blurted out in amazement, "Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much." He smiled, waved goodbye, and left, leaving me with a sense of relief. But that relief didn't last long. The next day, at almost the same time, the doorbell rang. I cautiously approached the peephole to see who was there, and to my surprise, it was the delivery man who had helped me set up the TV. My heart pounded with fear. What is he doing here? I wondered in panic. I decided to ignore him, pretending I wasn't home. As days passed, the man didn't stop coming back. Every day, he would show up and ring the doorbell. Even when the bell didn't ring, I somehow knew he was there. A sense of terror crept into me, making me feel completely helpless. I feared he might try to break in, to force the door open at any moment. All I could do was pray in silence that this nightmare wouldn't escalate into something worse. One day, after the doorbell had been silent for a long while, I thought he had finally left. I slowly crept toward the door and peeked through the peephole, only to hear a sudden voice coming from the darkness. "You can open the door now." His words, laced with a sinister smirk, felt like a punch to my heart. Fear gripped me fiercely. I fled from that apartment as fast as I could, heading to one of my college friends' places. I spent most of my time there, until my frequent visits started to feel burdensome, something I felt guilty about. I tried to hide my fears from everyone, avoiding questions I didn't want to answer, and sought refuge in my silence. Because of my shy nature, I didn't dare to speak about what had happened, but I dreaded the thought of returning to my apartment alone. Finally, when I couldn't bear it anymore, I confided in my friend about what had been happening. She didn't take it seriously, thinking I was overreacting, and suggested that perhaps the man had misinterpreted my smile and gratitude as a sign of interest. But I couldn't accept that I had done anything wrong. He had no right to harass a young woman living alone like that. Fortunately, in the end, the man disappeared and I never saw him again. Yet, I couldn't shake off the fear that had taken hold of me. Every time the doorbell rang, my heart would race, and I would hold my breath, bracing myself for the worst. It was a cold night in my second year at university as I finished my shift at my part-time job. I chose to take a different route home, which caused me to arrive much later than usual. The air was calm, and the city seemed to breathe in heavy silence under the dim streetlights, while my footsteps echoed through the dark surroundings, mingling with the cold breeze. When I finally reached my apartment building, I noticed a poorly written sign, barely hanging onto the elevator door, that read, "Elevator out of service." I sighed in frustration and fatigue. I had to climb 5 exhausting flights of stairs, and my tired footsteps echoed through the stairwell like ghostly whispers in the stillness of the night. I felt exhaustion weighing down on me, and each step drained the last remnants of my energy. When I finally reached the 5th floor, I pulled out my key and pushed it into the lock of my apartment door. I slowly opened the door and stepped inside, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt something was off. There was an uneasy sensation, as if the air had shifted or the space had been suddenly filled with invisible shadows that could not be seen by the naked eye. I couldn't explain this feeling clearly, but it was palpable. There was something unnatural, something that didn't belong. I reached for the light switch near the door and flicked it on, but darkness continued to envelop everything. I pressed the switch once, twice, 3 times, but still nothing happened. For a moment, a cold fear crept into my core, like a silent alarm ringing deep inside me. My heart began to race, as if I was facing something unknown, something waiting for me in the darkness. I moved forward slowly, every muscle in my body tense like a tightly drawn bowstring, my hand extended, feeling along the walls of my pitch-black apartment, until my fingertips brushed against the cold steel edge of the kitchen sink. I felt the blood freeze in my veins, and I caught my breath in a sharp gasp. Then, in the gloom, I saw it, a long, thin shadow standing in the middle of my living room. A faint light from the street seeped through the window, revealing only the outline of the figure, without any distinct facial features or clothing details. It was an unknown entity, silent and lifeless, a mere silhouette observing me quietly. Time seemed to freeze around me, and all the screams and thoughts were trapped in my chest, unable to escape. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, as if stuck in thick mud. The tall shadow remained still, its gaze fixed in my direction, and then, without warning, it began to approach me slowly, with heavy, dragging footsteps that echoed through the wooden floor in a terrifying murmur. Cold sweat trickled down my forehead, and every fiber of my being trembled with fear. I felt trapped, and all the sounds of the world vanished, until suddenly, my senses snapped back as if a surge of electricity had jolted through me. I stumbled backward, clutching the door handle, flung the door open with all my strength, and bolted into the hallway. My heart was pounding wildly as I pressed the elevator button frantically, not realizing it was still out of order. When the button didn't light up, I knew I had to find another way to escape. I ran toward the stairs, stumbling and gasping for breath, feeling as though every step I took carried me further from that strange presence in my apartment. When I finally reached the ground floor, I struggled to catch my breath, and then I heard something I couldn't comprehend. The elevator had started moving, descending toward the ground floor. How could it be working? I stood frozen, watching as the elevator doors slowly opened, dreading whatever might emerge. I sprinted to the nearest open convenience store, too terrified to return home that night. Over the following days, I bounced between friends' houses, spending nights on their couches, surrounded by a fragile sense of safety mixed with guilt for being a burden. Whenever someone asked why I seemed so anxious, I would avoid the question, unwilling to relive what had happened. Weeks passed before I finally gathered the courage to return, accompanied by friends to collect my belongings and move out. Everything in the apartment was just as I had left it. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken. Yet, the sense of dread lingered. Since that day, I could no longer tolerate darkness. I kept a flashlight by the door and always left a light on when leaving or before sleeping. It was a horrifying experience, one that I will never forget. I still don't know who that person was in my apartment or what they intended to do. It was one of those cold city nights wrapped in autumn colors, breathing the scent of fallen leaves, when I was living alone in my apartment near the university. It was my second year in college, the days of youth brimming with adventure and discovery. My apartment had become a gathering spot for friends who came and went as they pleased, to the extent that I had gotten used to leaving the door unlocked, something I had learned to do since my childhood in the countryside, where life was simple and people trusted each other. I didn't really care, even though the city wasn't like my old village. That day, I finished my part-time job late, and the streets were eerily quiet. The air was cold, and the wind carried with it the scent of damp earth. I walked with heavy steps, weighed down by the fatigue of the day. I finally reached the building, with silence wrapping around it like a thick blanket. I pushed my slightly ajar apartment door and stepped inside. The apartment was dark and cold. I stepped in, placing my bag on the floor, but I froze in my tracks when I noticed something unusual. On my bed, there was someone lying under the covers. At first, I felt shock, then frustration seeped into my heart. I had given my friends the freedom to come and go as they wished, and their presence in my apartment always brought me some comfort. But for one of them to sleep in my bed without permission, that crossed the line of comfortable hospitality. I looked toward the bed, where the covers completely concealed the person's body, and I couldn't see who it was. I prepared my small couch for sleeping, hoping the unwelcome guest would move soon. I stood there, scrutinizing the bed, observing the person who hadn't budged an inch. Something felt off. Their bodies seemed larger than I expected, as if the person under the covers wasn't one of my friends at all. I approached, trying to wake them, but when I whispered my friends' names one by one, I got no response. My silence turned into worry, and my heart began to pound, warning me that something was wrong. My mind raced, and a voice inside me started telling me this wasn't a joke. I drew closer, my hand trembling, and stood at the edge of the bed, my breath echoing in the dark room. As I reached out to touch the covers, the body moved violently, as if the person beneath was struggling with something invisible. Then, slowly, the covers slid down, revealing a pair of eyes wide open, glaring at me with pure hatred. I froze, seized by an overwhelming sense of terror. Those eyes were not human. It was a gaze filled with malice and coldness, the look of a being that knew no mercy. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, as though I had lost control of my voice. I don't remember how I got out of the apartment, but suddenly I found myself running down the street, gasping for air until I reached the nearest open store and collapsed on the ground. I called my friends, who came rushing over, and we made quick calls to make sure none of them had been in my apartment. Once we confirmed everyone was safe, we called the police. They searched the apartment thoroughly, but found nothing unusual, no trace of anyone, no signs of a break-in. Since that night, I never leave my apartment door unlocked, and I always make sure to leave the lights on, even when I'm not home. It was about 3 years ago, but the memories of that night still haunt me as if it happened just yesterday. Every time I think about it, I get goosebumps, as though I am reliving the moment all over again. The time that evening was nearing 9 p.m., and I had just gotten home after a long, exhausting day at work. I was physically and mentally drained, and all I wanted to do was lie in bed and fall asleep in silence. But in that very moment, the doorbell rang. I sighed bitterly and stood there for a few seconds, not wanting to deal with anything or anyone. I peered through the peephole in the door, and I saw a woman in her late 30s standing there. She seemed calm, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. Great, I thought to myself. She must be someone looking for religious donations or a door-to-door saleswoman. Something like that. Definitely not something I'm in the mood for right now. I pulled myself back toward the door and said aloud, "Yes?" Then I opened the door just a crack, so I wouldn't have to reveal myself completely. "Excuse me, is this the home of Mr. Kimura?" the woman asked politely, but there was an undertone of tension and worry in her voice, as though she was waiting for a definitive answer. "Yes, that's my name," I replied immediately, noticing that she had probably read my name on the mailbox in the hallway. But I wasn't prepared to meet anyone at that moment. I was tired, and all I wanted was to end the conversation quickly. "It's written on the mailbox, as you can see," I added wearily. But there was something strange about her. Her facial expression didn't suggest she was just a saleswoman or someone looking for something. She surprised me when she said, "You're Mr. Kimura, aren't you?" And she didn't stop there. She suddenly pushed the door with surprising force, making me open it wider. Then she yelled, looking me straight in the eyes, "It's you. Don't try to hide from me. You're Mr. Kimura, aren't you?" What happened next was utter chaos. I had no idea what to do. The woman kept pushing the door harder, and before I knew it, she had crossed the threshold and was inside my apartment without any resistance. In a moment of panic, I could only keep repeating, "No, no," while my mind tried to process the unexpected situation. She spoke quickly, as though she couldn't hear me or simply didn't care about what I was saying. "You, Mr. Kimura? I found you," she screamed loudly, as if in a manic state. I was in complete shock, and I didn't know what to do or how to react. All I wanted was to get her out of my apartment. While I pressed against the door, trying to push her out, I finally said in a shaky voice, "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." There was a moment of silence. The woman looked at me with a confused expression, then sighed and quickly left my apartment as if nothing had happened. I closed the door and double-checked that it was securely locked, putting the bolt in place. But the feeling of anxiety and distress didn't leave me. Even though everything seemed calm now, I felt as though something bad was about to happen. Hours passed, and eventually, I managed to rest my head on the pillow, but sleep was nowhere near me. The next day, while I was on my way home, I passed a narrow alley, and in one of its dark corners, I saw a young girl standing. She looked like a high school student, and her appearance reminded me strongly of the woman from the previous night. At first, I thought I was just overthinking things, but when she noticed me and started running toward me, she began shouting. She was holding something in her hand. A moment later, I realized it was a small knife, and she was waving it at me, screaming. She was running toward me with a knife in her hand, and the scene was terrifying beyond description. I ran as fast as I could, slammed the door of my apartment shut, and locked it behind me. Through the window, I saw her standing in the street, screaming, "Mr. Kimura, if you don't come out, I will kill you." Her voice was filled with madness and threats. My heart was pounding, and I quickly dialed the police. My hands were trembling, and my mind was completely disoriented. As I moved around my apartment, making sure the windows were locked and the curtains were drawn, the phone was still ringing. Finally, someone from the police answered, and I explained the situation in a voice full of fear. "We'll send someone right away." "Don't worry," they said. "They'll be there in about 2 minutes." But it wasn't that simple. The girl continued trying to reach my window. She was attempting to climb the wall, while her mother watched me from below in the garden with a strange smile. As the mother started looking around the garden for something, I quickly shut the curtains. I felt trapped. Suddenly, something started banging loudly on the window. The girl had reached it, and she was shouting, "I want to meet you." I was in my bathroom, frantically searching for anything I could use to defend myself. All I could find was a toilet brush. Minutes felt like hours, and then, suddenly, I heard a different voice, a male voice. "What are you doing here?" It sounded familiar. Yes, it was a police officer. "This is the police. Are you okay?" When I heard that voice, a deep sense of relief washed over me. Finally, after moments of terror, the nightmare was over. I was able to go to the police station, and I wanted to know why this had happened to me. How could a woman and her daughter be involved in such behavior? When the officers told me, I learned that this woman had committed the same crimes against another Mr. Kimura. Her daughter was now being cared for by another family member. But I didn't recognize the Mr. Kimura they were looking for, and I didn't understand what had led them to search for someone else with the same name. In the end, I seriously considered changing my name. But after all that I had gone through, I decided to leave this place entirely and move to another one where I could live in peace, far away from these nightmares.